from an early age. Human beings are shaped by experiences they often cannot fully understand. Childhood trauma is not merely an isolated event, but a wound that seeps into the psyche and hides in the shadows of the mind. Jung believed that everything we hear in childhood doesn't simply disappear with time. It continues to influence our behavior in adulthood. Think of a child who grows up in an environment where expressing emotions is seen as weakness. That child, upon becoming an adult, may struggle to connect emotionally without realizing that this barrier was built long before they had any awareness of it. The psychological impact of childhood trauma can be compared to invisible ink. It stains every area of life without the person noticing. Many insecurities, irrational fears, and self-destructive behavior patterns stem from experiences buried in the past. Without integrating those experiences into consciousness, the person remains governed by them, like a puppet whose strings are pulled by invisible hands. For example, someone raised by highly critical parents may become a perfectionist adult, unable to accept mistakes, not by choice, but because they learned that to err is to be rejected. The repression of these memories creates what Jung called the shadow, a central concept in his psychology. The shadow is composed of everything we deny in ourselves: pain, desires, insecurities, forbidden feelings. And the more we try to ignore it, the stronger it becomes. Have you ever noticed how some people are deeply irritated by traits in others that, in some way, reflect aspects they try to hide in themselves? That happens because what we reject within us always finds a way to manifest, even if it's projected onto others. And don't think the shadow is limited to major traumas. Small wounds, like the feeling of not being heard in childhood, can generate a lifetime of searching for validation, of trying to be accepted in every possible way, without realizing that this need comes from an ancient void. Jung said we only become whole when we look within and face what torments us. But how do we do that? How do we begin to see something that has been hidden for so long? Interestingly, life always gives clues. Our strongest reactions, our repetitive patterns, our unexplained fears, all these are signs that something buried needs to rise to the surface. Who hasn't been surprised by an exaggerated reaction to a simple situation? Sometimes, a single comment can trigger an emotional response that leads us to act disproportionately. That is not random. These are childhood traumas still alive inside us, waiting to be acknowledged. But the problem is, most people avoid this process. Looking at your own shadow takes courage. It means admitting that some of the pain we carry wasn't only caused by the outside world, it was also perpetuated by ourselves throughout life. And that realization can be deeply uncomfortable. However, Jung believed that true freedom only comes when we have the courage to illuminate what is in the dark. And perhaps the question that remains is where to begin. One of the most effective ways is self-observation, paying attention to the emotions that arise in daily situations, questioning impulsive reactions, and investigating their roots. Instead of simply accepting, "This is how I am," it's worth asking, well, why am I this way? Was there a specific experience that shaped this behavior? Something I heard repeatedly in childhood. This kind of reflection opens the door to a new level of self-awareness. And once that door is opened, a whole new world is revealed. But recognizing the shadow is only the first step. What comes after? How do we deal with what we find in the depths of the psyche? Here we enter one of the most profound aspects of Carl Jung's psychology, the role of the unconscious and the archetypes that emerge from trauma. The unconscious is an invisible dimension that governs much of our decisions, emotions, and behaviors. Carl Jung was one of the first to explore this hidden part of the psyche in depth, showing that there is much more within us than we consciously perceive. The unconscious doesn't merely store repressed memories. It shapes thought patterns and emotional responses that we repeat without realizing. Imagine someone with a deep fear of abandonment without understanding why. That fear may not have originated in adulthood, but in a childhood marked by emotional insecurity, perhaps due to distant parents or experiences of rejection. Within this unconscious, There are powerful forces Jung called archetypes, universal patterns that influence our way of being and our perception of the world. When someone experiences trauma in childhood, certain archetypes are activated and begin to guide that person's life. A classic example is the victim archetype. After painful experiences early on, the person begins to see themselves as helpless, lacking control over their own destiny. This archetype may manifest in thoughts like, "Things always go wrong for me," or "Nothing I do matters." Another common archetype born from trauma is the savior. Many people who grew up in chaotic or abusive environments develop a deep need to save others, because at some point they learned that their value lies in helping, not simply in being. These individuals often enter toxic relationships, take on responsibilities that aren't theirs, and constantly prioritize the needs of others above their own. How often do we see emotionally exhausted people who live trying to fix other people's lives? But how do these archetypes show up in everyday life? Think of the person who, without realizing it, always ends up in relationships with emotionally unavailable partners, or the one who subconsciously sabotages their career because they fear success. These patterns are not random. They come from stories the unconscious repeats over and over, based on childhood wounds. And what's most curious is that the more we ignore these patterns, the more they repeat, as if the unconscious is saying, "Hey, you still haven't resolved this, so I'm going to put this situation in front of you again." The first step in breaking this cycle is identifying which archetype has been dominating your life. Have you taken on the role of the victim, the savior, or the exhausted warrior who never asks for help? Each of these patterns has a root in the unconscious, and bringing them into the light of awareness is already a major step forward. A good practice is to observe which situations trigger intense emotional reactions. What irritates you most in others? What challenges keep repeating in your life? Asking these questions can lead to surprising revelations. And now I ask you, have you ever noticed a pattern repeating in your life with no logical explanation? Has this ever happened to you? Tell me in the comments. The good news is that archetypes are not static. Once we become aware of them, they can be transformed. Jung called this process individuation, a path of self-knowledge and integration of the unconscious. This means you don't have to be a prisoner of your past, but to change, you must be willing to face the shadows that dwell in your mind. And it's precisely at this point that one of the most fascinating concepts in Jungian psychology comes into play: the inner child. Within every adult lives a child who never stopped existing. Carl Jung saw the inner child as an essential part of the psyche, one that carries both spontaneous joy and the deepest wounds. Many emotional difficulties in adulthood arise precisely because this child was ignored, repressed, or wounded at some point. When a child grows up in an environment where they don't feel loved, valued, or safe, that experience gets imprinted in the unconscious and manifests in many ways in adult life, whether through difficulty trusting others, fear of rejection, or a constant need for validation. But how do you know if your inner child is wounded? There are some clear signs: excessive self-criticism, difficulty accepting compliments, a constant sense of emptiness, or the feeling that you're never good enough. These feelings often stem from internalized messages from childhood, words spoken by parents, teachers, or other important figures who unknowingly shaped a distorted self-image. A child who was constantly compared to others may grow up believing they must be perfect to be loved. One whose emotions were invalidated may become an adult who doesn't know how to recognize or express their own feelings. The good news is that the inner child doesn't disappear. They merely hide, waiting to be heard and to heal them. It's necessary to establish a dialogue with this forgotten part of yourself. This can be done in several ways. One simple yet powerful technique is to write a letter to your younger self. Ask what they miss, what they're afraid of, and what they would like to hear. It may seem like a simple exercise, but many people are surprised by the deep emotions that emerge. Another effective practice is to recall activities that brought joy in childhood and bring them back into your adult life. Dancing for no reason, drawing, playing with a pet. All of this can be a way to reconnect with this vital part of the psyche. Moreover, speaking to yourself kindly is an essential step. So often, we are our harshest critics, internally repeating the same cruel words we once heard. But when a child falls while learning to walk, no one calls them incompetent. Instead, we encourage them to try again. So why don't we treat ourselves with the same patience? The way we speak to ourselves can either strengthen or weaken our inner child. Another crucial point is learning to validate your emotions. If you were taught to swallow your tears or to always be strong, you may have learned to ignore your own feelings. But emotions don't disappear. They build up and manifest in other ways, like anxiety, irritability, or even physical symptoms. Creating the habit of naming what you feel without judging it is already a huge step toward healing. And speaking of physical symptoms, childhood trauma is not limited to the mind, it is also recorded in the body. Many of the emotional blockages we carry can manifest as muscle tension, digestive problems, or even chronic pain. But how does the body store these memories? And more importantly, how can we release them? Many people believe trauma is exclusively psychological, but Carl Jung and other scholars of the psyche have long pointed out that the body is also a great repository of our emotional pain. What isn't processed by the mind ends up stored in the muscles, in our posture, in our breathing, and even in our internal organs. That's why some people carry unexplained tension in their shoulders, feel a constant pressure in their chest, or suffer from chronic digestive issues without any clear medical cause. The body speaks, and often it's telling a story the mind refuses to hear. Modern science has confirmed this connection between trauma and the body. Researchers like Bessel van der Kolk, author of The Body Keeps the Score, explained that traumatic experiences trigger physiological responses that can become permanent. The nervous system, when exposed to repeated stress in childhood, can enter a state of hypervigilance where the body reacts constantly as if under threat, even when there is no real danger. This can result in chronic anxiety, insomnia, and persistent muscular pain. If you've ever wondered why your body is always tense for no apparent reason, perhaps the answer lies in memories you haven't yet released. So here comes an important question. How do we release the body from these invisible imprints? One of the most effective practices is movement. Walking, dancing, practicing yoga, or even doing simple stretching exercises can help unlock tension accumulated over the years. What might seem like just a daily stretch could, in fact, be helping to release emotions trapped since childhood. Breathing techniques are also powerful, as they help regulate the nervous system and bring the mind back to the present moment. Another compelling approach is somatic therapy, which works directly with the body's stored memories. This type of therapy focuses on helping the body complete responses that were interrupted in the past. For example, a child who experienced intense fear may have had the impulse to run, but couldn't. That impulse gets stuck in the body, generating anxiety and tension years later. Somatic therapies allow those responses to finally be completed, bringing both emotional and physical relief. So now I ask you, have you ever felt like your body carries tension that doesn't seem to have a logical explanation? Sometimes pain and discomfort are linked to repressed emotions. Have you ever felt this way? Share your experience in the comments. I'd love to learn from your journey as well. Connecting body and mind starts with simple practices. Conscious breathing for a few minutes upon waking, massaging areas of the body that usually hold tension, or just pausing to notice how you're sitting, walking, or breathing. These are all ways to begin this process. If the body is a book, then each pain or discomfort is a page that can be read and understood. And as we read these pages, we begin to see patterns. We discover that certain emotions and physical pains are linked to specific episodes in our history. This understanding is essential to the process of individuation, the central concept of Carl Jung that teaches us how to transform pain into strength. But how does this process work? How can we integrate our shadow, our traumas, and become more complete versions of ourselves? Carl Jung said that individuation is the process of becoming who you truly are. a journey of self-discovery that requires courage, because it forces us to look within and face everything we've avoided. It's a process that doesn't happen overnight, but rather unfolds over the course of a lifetime. Yet few people truly dare to walk this path because it is much easier to project our shadows onto others and blame the outside world for our inner conflicts. But those who do not face their own wounds become prisoners of them. Individuation is, therefore, an act of liberation. The first step in this process is awareness. Jung stated, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Many people believe they are trapped in certain circumstances without realizing that it is their own unconscious patterns creating those repetitive situations. Have you ever noticed how some people always end up in the same types of toxic relationships, or how others seem to be constantly on the verge of failure? No matter how hard they try to move forward, this doesn't happen by accident. These are unconscious repetitions trying to bring to the surface something that needs to be resolved. But how can we break these cycles? The first step is to recognize which patterns are governing your life. Try this exercise. Think of 3 recurring difficulties you face, and whether in relationships, at work, or in your self-esteem. Observe which situations keep repeating. Now ask yourself, when in my childhood did I feel this way for the first time? This simple question can reveal a lot about the root of these challenges. If you often feel like you're never enough at work, perhaps you grew up hearing that you had to try your hardest just to be accepted. If you're always afraid of being abandoned, maybe that fear started in childhood when you felt left out or neglected by an attachment figure. However, identifying the root of the problem is not enough. The next step is reframing. Many people spend years trapped in a narrative of, "My parents damaged me for life." But that doesn't transform pain into strength. It only perpetuates suffering. Jung suggested that healing happens when we can give new meaning to our past. This doesn't mean denying the pain or minimizing what happened, but rather seeing those experiences as part of our story and as catalysts for growth. Think of the blacksmith's metaphor. When raw metal is placed in the fire, it becomes malleable. But it still needs to be shaped by firm blows until it takes its final form. The same is true for the human psyche. Life's challenges and pain are like that intense fire that makes us receptive to transformation. But without the shaping process, which is individuation, we remain just raw material, undefined, uncentered, and lacking mastery over ourselves. Another key in this process is the integration of the shadow. Often we fight against traits we consider negative in ourselves. If we were taught that feeling anger is wrong, we suppress that emotion until it eventually explodes in destructive ways. If we learned that showing vulnerability is weakness, we become cold and emotionally distant. But Jung taught that we shouldn't eliminate these darker aspects. We should integrate them consciously. Someone who has always repressed their anger may discover that, when properly channeled, that same energy turns into assertiveness and personal power. Similarly, someone who fears vulnerability may realize that accepting their emotions actually makes them stronger, not weaker. Furthermore, creativity plays a vital role in this process. Many of our repressed emotions can be expressed through art, writing, music, or even physical activity. Jung saw art as a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, a way to bring out internal content that we can't access through rational thought alone. If you've ever felt relief after writing about a problem, painting without worrying about the result, or dancing without thinking, then you've already tasted this process of integration. And there's a fascinating aspect to this path. As we progress in individuation, we become less reactive to the external world. Situations that used to throw us off balance are faced with more composure. People who once pushed our buttons no longer hold that power over us. This happens because by integrating our own shadows, we stop projecting them onto others. It's as if we were once trapped in a play, where everyone around us was acting out a script we didn't even know existed. And suddenly, we become the directors of our own story. This doesn't mean that pain disappears completely. The past still exists. Emotional scars don't vanish. But there is a huge difference between carrying an open wound and carrying a scar. The former hurts at the slightest touch. The latter is a reminder of what we've already overcome. And this is the true power of individuation, transforming wounds into wisdom, pain into growth, and the shadow into a source of strength. But there is one area of life where the influence of childhood trauma becomes especially evident. Relationships, whether romantic, platonic, or professional, our childhood wounds continue to echo in our interactions. So how does the past shape the way we connect with others? And how can we avoid repeating destructive patterns and build healthier connections? Our earliest relationships define how we perceive the world and those around us. Carl Jung believed that childhood experiences create inner templates that serve as references for all future relationships. If a child grows up in an environment of love and safety, they're more likely to develop secure attachment, trusting others and feeling free to express emotions. But if childhood was marked by neglect, emotional abuse, or instability, those experiences can turn into destructive patterns that repeat in adulthood. What's most intriguing is that these patterns aren't always obvious. Often, a person who experienced rejection in childhood may develop a seemingly independent personality, someone who doesn't need anyone. But deep down, that independence might just be a defense mechanism, a shield against the possibility of being hurt again. Similarly, someone who didn't receive enough affection as a child may develop an anxious attachment style, constantly seeking validation from others and fearing abandonment. Have you ever noticed these patterns in someone else, or even in yourself? The unconscious has a curious way of trying to heal old wounds. It makes us repeat certain dynamics in the hope that this time, the outcome will be different. That's why some people always end up in toxic relationships, choosing partners who treat them similarly to how they were treated in childhood, not because they enjoy suffering, but because there is an unconscious desire to rewrite that story, to finally receive the love and acceptance they didn't get in the past. The problem is that this search rarely brings the expected result. When we repeat patterns, the trauma only deepens, reinforcing the belief that love hurts or that no one can truly be trusted. To break this cycle, it's essential to become aware of it. A powerful exercise is to observe your own relationships and ask yourself, is there a pattern here? Do I always choose the same type of person? Do my relationships trigger the same fears and insecurities over and over again? This kind of reflection can reveal a lot about the unconscious dynamics shaping your life. But here's the good news. It's possible to reframe those experiences and build healthier relationships. It begins with self-responsibility. Many people enter relationships expecting the other person to fill their emotional voids. But this expectation is dangerous. Jung said that we project onto others what we haven't resolved within ourselves. That's why so many relationships fail. Because we expect someone to love us in the way our parents didn't. We place a huge burden on that person and create inevitable frustration. True love doesn't come from need. It comes from inner wholeness. And how do we build that wholeness? One essential step is learning to validate yourself. If you've always sought approval from others, try asking, if I didn't need anyone's acceptance, what would I do differently? This simple question can reveal how many decisions were made just to please others. In addition, building healthier relationships means establishing clear boundaries. Many people who experience childhood trauma struggle to say no because they fear rejection. But learning to protect yourself is one of the greatest acts of self-love you can offer. Now let me ask you, have you noticed how your past influences the way you relate to others? Do you consider yourself more emotionally detached, or do you fear abandonment? Let me know in the comments. Rebuilding the way we connect with others isn't a quick process, but it is liberating. And when we begin to break free from those old cycles, we make room for something greater, the true understanding of who we are beyond the trauma. But in the end, who are we without our pain? What remains when we stop defining ourselves by the wounds of the past? Childhood trauma can leave deep marks, shaping the way we think, feel, and relate to the world. But here's the truth. These wounds don't have to define us forever. Healing is possible, and the first step is understanding how to deal with the pain from the past. And what if I told you that there are real ways to transform that pain into self-knowledge and growth? I left a video on the end screen where we explore exactly that. How to heal the wounds of your childhood through the teachings of Carl Jung. Few people are discovering what you still don't know. There are doors that can only be opened with the right keys. Will you dare to search for them? Subscribe to the channel and find your true path.